everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And today I'm joined by writer Linda Cracknell. Hello, Linda.
Hello. Thank you
And
for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. And we're here to talk mainly about your new novel, The Other Side of Stone, which I've seen described as a novella elsewhere. How do you think of it?
It's also been described as a collection of stories. So I think the jury's really out about what the form is. Yeah, it's a conundrum, I think, what it is. It's short story-like in the sense that there's different characters that appear in their own story between 1831 and 2019. All in connection with a Perthshire woolen mill. But what makes it a little bit less like a collection of stories is there's one character whose story comes up several times, and she's pretty central. So I think without her, the other stories wouldn't completely make sense.
Yeah, I think
so. I don't know what it is.
Well, I think that's really interesting in itself, because it is. I didn't think, when I read it, I didn't think of it as a novella, and I didn't think of it as separate stories. Although you're absolutely right, they could be read as separate stories should you want to do that. But in terms of the structure, does it come after you've decided what stories to tell, or did you kind of have an idea that this is how you wanted to tell these stories?
No, it's been very sort of incremental how this book has come about, and I don't think I'm letting you into any big secret if I say I actually started it as a novel 20 years ago. And it was going to be something quite different. It was mainly the story from 2006, which is about a young male architect who buys a derelict industrial building and converts it into quite kind of flashy flat, but decides to take one for himself and his wife.
Yeah.
And I knew when I started writing that they were initially my main characters, but that something had happened in the past in that building that was going to make itself felt on their current lives. And actually I came across that thing by accident, and that kind of took over. So that created a voice in 1913-14, which demanded to be written. And then I probably abandoned that as a novel around 2006. But I couldn't quite leave behind the context of the building and all the imaginative work I'd done in creating that. So over the years, I've imagined other characters and other scenarios which still link to that building, even if it's a bit tangential, and help to tell the wider story. So I can't pretend that it was planned. And if it does make a satisfying whole, which is what people seem to be saying, it's I guess, as a writer, you'll have to trust your intuition quite a lot. And I guess there was some of that going on in the background to make it. It was only fairly recently I actually thought about putting all the stories together and seeing if that would make a book.
That's really interesting, because the mill is a kind of character in its own right, and to know that you, I think by the time you get to those later stories and they're being turned into flats, it almost feels to me like a haunted building. It's got this past. So it's really interesting that actually you started at the end and worked, backwards to where this past began. Is that how you think of it, as a kind of its own character?
I do, yes. Yes, I do. And I also think of it as a kind of casket of memories of all the people that have had something to do with it, so that inevitably it's permeated with the lives that have gone before that have had something to do with it, and they've all affected it in some way, some more than others. So it's a kind of memory repository, and I think it stops short of being supernatural. I don't think it is quite a ghost story. but I did intend there to be a sort of feeling of a reverberation of things having happened associated with that building.
I read it as not supernatural, you're right, but something eerie, in the sense that this is a building that clearly has an effect on the people, on some of the people that come into contact with it. Quite a profound effect, actually, on some of them.
Yes, and it's yeah, they behave differently towards it, and some are more affectionate than others. And Catherine, who's the character who repeats, it sort of starts off being her friend because she speaks to it, and
Yeah.
she's pretty lonely in this village that she's arrived in as a new wife of a weaver who's working in the mill. And so she's actually not able to work herself, although she's come from a background in the cotton industry and around Paisley. And so actually she spends a lot of time sitting kind of in conversation, rather a one-way conversation with the face of the building, which she's not permitted to enter, actually, because her husband's in there working. And it starts off with her being almost like a friend, you know, that she can confide in and joke with. But by the end, they're pretty much enemies, I think.
Yeah, it's almost like her husband is almost having an affair, and it's with the building, or it's like, so that's the he has changed. Because that's the story, I have to say, that really kind of stayed with me the longest, because I don't want to give anything away, but you have a kind of backstory to particularly how they shared ideals when they were in Glasgow in particular at that time, and they seem to share ideals at least, and then how the husband almost betrays those as his situation changes. And there is a distinct sense of betrayal, I think, with the central character, the narrator.
Yes, I think I would call it. She certainly sees it herself as a betrayal, and you know, they've shared this kind of socialist vision when they were back on the West Coast. You know, they were very much part of that period of intense industrial unrest, 1910 to 14, and you know, they took great pleasure in parading with others on May Day, and he was fully behind women's suffrage.
Yeah.
But once they were married and they were settled in the village that he came from with all his kind of family around him, you know, he wanted his meal on the table every night. And not only that, but this mill, being in Highland Perthshire, was a bit separate from any other mills. And so the workers weren't necessarily aware of all the industrial unrest going on in the textile industry elsewhere. And they tended to be these isolated mills tended to be quite family orientated, quite paternalistic. So when he's offered the job of foreman, he takes it. And then he's in the management, and there's no question of him sporting strike action or anything like that. And so she definitely thinks he's lost his kind of backbone. And you know, he's very reluctant for her to take any kind of work, and starts feeling embarrassed by the action that she takes in the cause that she's so passionate about for women's suffrage.
And what inspired the initial idea? What inspired the idea that this mill had these stories to tell, or at least one initial story to tell?
Well, I think that I'm always very fascinated by derelict buildings, particularly industrial ones. And my first job after leaving university was in a woolen mill in Devon, actually, that had been it had finished its days quite late, really, for the woolen industry, and it had been left with these, you know, vast halls. And rather like the mill in my book, it was in a very small village, but a huge building in a small village. So it sort of eclipsed lots of other things in the village. But it was left with, you know, these vast halls of black machinery and the smell of lanolin and the steam engine and the water wheel. And, you know, really it was very archaic. And so I worked in converting with others this huge building to be a working museum, which is still going, actually. So that's rather pleasing. And So I had that experience, and I think my initial idea when I first had the architect character, I actually, where I live in Perthshire, there's a whole system of hydroelectric schemes, as you'll know, and some of the buildings associated with them are really beautiful and fascinating. And I had in my mind at first that it might be one of those. And then I thought, oh, well, actually, it makes a lot more sense if it's, you know, part of the textile industry and I know something about that. And actually, I live in Aberfeldy, and there is a much smaller than in my story, tweed mill, which is still running here, in a very small way, but they do still weave tweed. So I had that as a kind of reference point. So I knew it was credible that there could have been an isolated tweed mill in a small village in Perthshire.
So then when you decide that you're going to tell other stories, is that a case of then going, finding stories to tell and then researching them? I mean, how does it then work?
Well, the Catherine, the kind of suffragette story was a complete accident, and it was because I was looking for a background of industrial unrest, and I was looking at back copies of the Perthshire Advertiser, and of course that period 1910 to 14 quickly came up as when there was massive industrial unrest all over Perthshire. It was the painters and the dyers and the plumbers and the bakers were all threatening strike or out on strike. Yeah. And then amongst all these headlines, and also great banner headlines of invitations for people to move to Canada, where there would be great prospects job-wise, I found a story about, well, it wasn't a story, it was true, but it was a man in the village of Kinloch Ranach, who was in court, and he was quite had a lowly kind of job, but he was in court suing his wife for divorce because she'd become a suffragette.
Wow.
And I found this really fascinating. And, there were complaints that she'd stopped cooking his meals. She started reading Tolstoy. She'd become a suffragette and was always off at meetings. And then she'd moved out with the children. And the last thing she did was she went to Canada. And so he was actually in court while she was away in Canada trying to get his divorce. And the conflict between them had arisen because she'd wanted to have her own work. And obviously that was quite difficult then as a married woman, because you had to have your husband's permission, and he'd refused to give it. So that was what prompted the conflict. And so I took that idea for Catherine as well, that she's determined that she's going to become a nurse and she's going to do her training, but she needs her husband's signature.
Yeah.
And she's got to wait. He makes her wait.
So it's fascinating that you settled on these three stories. Were you ever tempted to tell more? Because I'm guessing you've got this wide expanse of time, where you thought, well, maybe there could be something in the 50s or the 60s, or, were you happy then with what you had?
Yes, I was actually. And I've sort of wondered about that a bit, because there are some big gaps. So, we start in 1831 with the stonemason, actually putting the dedication stone above the main door. And we finish in 2019 when, well, let's say there's not as much mill as there was. But there are clusters date-wise of the stories which really focus around the demise of the woolen industry. So the last tweed is woven in 1990, and things kind of stagger to a halt after that. But actually, it felt that those were the stories I wanted to tell, and I think they came very naturally. They did take research, but only, they kind of, the idea for them arose not so much from the research as Catherine's story did, but just more that that was a period in the history of the mill that wanted to be told. And so I didn't kind of go through and think, oh, I better have one in the late 19th century or whatever, or in the 1940s. It wasn't how it came about. And I suppose I'm expecting quite a lot of the reader, because you know, as is typical in short stories, there's a lot that's not written.
Yeah.
So the reader's always having to work quite hard to fill in the gaps. But in this case, they're also having to fill in the gaps between the stories.
Yeah.
So it takes quite an, you know, I'm asking the reader to use quite a lot of imagination themselves.
Yeah, but how it's got, the mill's got from one point to the next point where we meet it. But it does seem to me, from what I've read of yours, is that place has got as much importance, sometimes if not more, than the people. That you're interested in the stories that are there and the stories that you don't tell, but there's a sense that there are other stories happening. So that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think, well, place is central to my writing, and so is memory. And in my last book was about walking, and it was a non-fiction book, which was about walking in the footsteps of either myself or previous travelers along the path for some purpose, and finding that the story, there was a sort of story underfoot, if you like, in the places that particular route went through. And so I suppose I'm often feeling that sense of retrieving memory from being in a particular place. So place is usually, is that true? It's usually quite a strong starting point. My last novel, Call of the Undertow, was set in coastal Caithness, and that was intimately associated with a particular place and my exploration of it.
That's what I was thinking of. I think that's the last thing I've read of yours, and it was about mapping and cartography, and so there was not just the physical, but also, as you said, maybe the memory that had yet to be uncovered in it.
Yes, yeah, I think that is really important, and all the kind of, you know, an awful lot of the framework of that story actually did arise from things that I found along the way in that particular small patch. You know, there was some amazing folk tales, and there were all sorts of nooks and crannies and all sorts of things that you could sort of look at and think, oh, what's going on there? You know? Including sand being removed from the dunes and that kind of thing.
But I think I remember reading about you that you like to get out there. You like to be on the land and, you know, walking and discovering for you know, it's not just people have this idea of a writer that they're behind a keyboard and, you know, barely see the sun, but that's not you. You like to actually go out there and kind of physically interact with what you're going to write about.
Yes, I do. Yeah, I can't really write without walking. And it's partly a sort of, you know, part of the kind of mental
Yes.
refreshment and digestion, and partly observation. You know, in some cases, as I say, I have made the walking into part of the writing, but mostly it's to do with the kind of state of mind that you're in when you walk, and you're kind of half focused on the place that you're in, and half focused on what's going on in your mind, and somehow the cadence of that seems to be good for my imagination. I know lots of writers who are similar. You know, it's kind of part of the toolkit, really.
As an aside, since this past year when we've all been doing pretty much nothing but walking or staying inside, have you found that things have changed for you in terms of that, or has it just been business as usual?
Business as usual, but perhaps at times, particularly in the first lockdown, I felt an awful lot of my freelance work was cancelled.
Yeah.
And so I did have a sense of having more time. I have to say that hasn't sustained, you know, I don't feel, you know, it kind of, the freelance work came back again, fortunately. Yeah. But in that period, I probably walked further in my own local area, and I discovered places I'd never been to. And I've lived here for 26 years or something. So, you know, that was quite surprising that there were still places I could discover, or, you know, and I kind of set myself, sometimes, not always, but, you know, that I had to try out one new path on every walk, you know, just try something slightly different. And so, yeah, so I think I probably went a bit further. You know, I always give myself at least an hour a day walking, but I probably spent more than an hour a day during that period. And ideally, I would use more than an hour a day doing that.
And
yeah,
did that bring new stories to you, or was it just a case of actually, I'm doing this? I guess you don't go walking with the idea that there will be a new story every time, but were you discovering new places and perhaps walking more often even than before? Were there new stories that kind of came to you?
Well, nothing's happened yet. However, I'm quite interested in a couple of ruined villages that I discovered. And there's an area just up the hill from the town that I've never really explored. And the reason that I've never explored it is because it's covered in plantation forestry, which I don't like very much.
Right.
Because it's a bit boring. You can't see out and you're on a track. But actually, I've started to find it quite interesting, because if you, instead of following the tracks, if you follow the burns and the kind of, which are all tributaries of the Monash Burn, which goes through the Berks of Aberfeldy, there are these lovely corridors of relatively untouched land, which won't have been touched since those plantations were put in probably in the 50s.
Yeah.
And so they're lovely kind of corridors of native trees and tumbling water and so on. And I have the impression that apart from me, it's mainly sort of deer and rabbits who are in these places. So I found that really interesting, and I don't know whether that's going to lead to some writing, but I think it might do. Yeah, it feels. And the other thing is that when you get into the plantation, what I hadn't realised before is that there were areas that were left unplanted because there were cultural remains. So
Right.
a village or further, and whether it was out of archaeological sensitivity or just because it was too difficult to, plough it up to plant trees, I don't know. But they're quite spooky, actually. You get these clearings, and then there's, the clear outlines of houses and lime kilns and bits and pieces. So that's quite fascinated me. And as I say, I'm not sure yet what that might lead to, but I've got very interested in these kind of hidden ways and hidden tributaries that are under the forest. It's a bit like being under the sea or something.
That idea of Scotland in particular having these hidden stories or hidden places, and there are lots of them. I think that comes through strongly in the other side of Stone as well, because initially people might, I've driven through Perth many, many times, and you do see these mills. Many of them are probably now, flats and things like that. But to look at them and say, what's the story? What's the hidden story under there? I think is quite very interesting.
Yeah, I can't, especially if it's derelict. I don't know, it has a great appeal to me for some reason. I know it's pitiful, really, because it's much nicer if they're in use. But there's something about abandoned buildings which is very fascinating. And yeah, the sadness about them as well.
So is that what it's about? That the kind of stories that were there are no longer going to be told? That building is kind of kept its secrets, and then you decide perhaps what those stories are. Is that something? I'm just wondering why
inadvertently
those buildings are so fascinating.
Yeah, I have to say that the other side of Stone wasn't based on any real building. I invented it and plonked it in a fictional village, which I'm not, it's not, it's a bit further north than where I live, but it's not a village that exactly exists. But yeah, I think I started more from the angle of looking at this architect and thinking, what would a young ambitious architect take as his project? What kind of building would appeal to him? Something that he could look heroic by recovering it from imminent collapse.
Yeah.
And so that was where the first seed of it was more in the kind of somebody with the idea that they could make a bit of a splash by recovering a building like that without having any respect, I suppose, for what it had been.
Yeah.
And what that dangers might bring.
That's what I think I meant about the eerie aspect of it, because it read to me as though the building rebels against this attempt to kind of abuse it, I suppose, or take advantage of it is probably the better way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
At the beginning, we asked you, kind of how to describe the novel, and you said, well, some people have said it's this, some people have said it's other, and it made me think about how you approach publishers with, do you have to pitch an idea to a publisher like someone might for a film or a television show? I'm just interested in the kind of practicalities of that.
Well, you do pitch, yes, because the normal way of submitting is to send, depending on what they want, either the whole manuscript or part of it with a synopsis, and the synopsis is the selling instrument, really, which has got to try and define it. And this book is published by a very new publisher, Taproot Press, who, God love them, were asking for unusual forms. So I think I was very lucky there because they got it. I'd say in the past it's been very difficult to find publishers who want collections of short stories. It's easier to get individual short stories published, but collections, you're often told that they don't sell, and there's a sort of, it's a strange one, because people say that they like short stories, but then bookshops say that people don't want to buy them. So so a collection of short stories is a difficult thing to sell. However, I do think if they're linked in some way, they immediately have a bit more appeal, because they can almost appear to be something else.
I was going to say, a way to do it is to make it look like a novel. That's the way to get it. I have to say,
and I do think there are some things which are called novels which appear as which are sold as sold as novels, but when you really get to them, they're more like collections of linked stories.
I would say that Trainspotting is a collection of short stories moved together. That would be my argument for that. I think the design of the book is absolutely gorgeous. I have to say, they've done a lovely job.
Isn't it lovely? Yeah,
and even down to the kind of handwritten dates and titles on the thing. It again, it makes it feel,
Yeah, it's my handwriting, by the way.
Ah, very nice handwriting.
Yes. Which was rather a special touch. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's interesting you say that they were looking for unusual forms, because I've written down, well, with the idea of pitching to other publishers in mind, that your writing doesn't fit kind of easy categorization. I think that's fair to say. There's kind of, there's often a natural aspect to it, but then there's often a kind of puzzle aspect to it as well. And there's, it's at a time when people are often looking to fit writers or anyone into kind of neat boxes. It's quite, I think, some of the best writers are the ones that don't. I think that's quite a nice thing. Have you ever felt?
I suppose the other thing is.
Yeah, on you go. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I suppose the other thing is that as a writer, you want to be continually developing, and so you don't necessarily want to produce something that was a bit like the other one, even though So I suppose you're never going to have. Well, I probably will never have huge departures, because I kind of know roughly what my territory is. But it would be nice to think that there is a sort of development in terms of the different kinds of way you might treat your subject matter. I did go on a songwriting course just 18 months ago or so, which I have to say I've not done anything with it, but I thought, there's these other forms that are out there which could be really fun, and I had a marvelous introduction to songwriting with a lot of very talented people who were a bit scary. They weren't scary, I was scared, they weren't scary. And so there's so many forms that are you want to feel that you're learning, and so I'd like to think that I'm expanding my repertoire rather than repeating, if you like.
And you mentioned earlier on that your last book was nonfiction. Do you decide when you sit down, what I'm going to write today is nonfiction, or do you start with something that maybe could be fiction, and you think, oh no, this is not what this is? How does that work?
Well, with the book about walking, Doubling Back, I think I just realized at some point that I was very interested in walking in sort of memory footsteps. and that that lent itself for that particular project to nonfiction. So rather than the walking being a tool for writing, it would actually become the subject matter. And I thought of it initially, I suppose, as travel writing. But it isn't quite travel writing, because there's quite a lot of memoir in it, really. It's not only my own memories, but there's quite a lot of my own memories in it. And so I suppose you could say it's a walking memoir. And just now I'm writing about my seafaring ancestry and trying to work out what that means to me. So that's nonfiction as well. But it's not to say that these things may not reappear in some other in some other form of fiction, but I think that may take a little longer to digest.
So the book about your seafaring, it's your family's past, is that what it is? Yeah,
through my sort of my mother's mother's line. The family came from one small town in Devon, on the north coast of Devon, where they'd been seafarers for centuries, and the surname was Drake, and there was a Francis in every in every group of siblings, male and female, I should say. Whether there's a real connection back to himself, I'm not sure, but anyway, I've got more and more interested in this, and also sort of aware of my own relationship to the sea, which particularly during lockdown, I absolutely longed to be at the sea because I couldn't get there, and realized that that's a sort of very strong tug, even though I've not really had a great life. And, you know, I've been on boats and sailed and stuff, but hasn't been a major part of my life. And then, so I've just been finding out more about this, particularly late 19th and early 20th century. The family had small, relatively small tall ships, you'd call them, ketches, which were doing very ordinary job, you know, that nowadays is done mostly on roads and railways, taking cargo around Britain. And it was so mundane in the way that trucks on the road are now that nobody took any notice of it as being anything worth preserving. So there's actually which I've been able to sail on, because it's used as a sort of holiday ship, if you like. And so it's a bit of it's a bit of a mixture of memoir and social history and digging about in my past, in my family's past, to try and work out who's who.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. And have you any thoughts about future fiction, or at the moment is it all about the other side of stone?
Well, I have another novel which is cooked, I think. Excellent. But not yet in the hands of a publisher. But I am itching to get back to writing some more fiction. Actually, it does feel there's a particular way of noticing things, which when I do it, I think, oh, that's asking to be fiction. And I've noticed that that's just been starting to happen recently. So I think it must be time to start thinking about what comes next.
That's really interesting. It feels like after a while, you have to kind of scratch the itch and say, no, it's time to write stories again. Well,
yeah,
Linda,
I think I am a fiction writer.
Linda, thank you so much for having a chat with me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Enjoyed it.
Oh, good, good. And we'll be back soon with somebody completely different. Cheers.